I was 22 when the idea of the jungle stopped being a place on a map and became something personal. It wasn't recklessness that pulled me there, it was restlessness. I had just come out of military service, and for the first time in years, no one was telling me where to be or who to become. Freedom felt wide open, but also hollow. I wanted something real, untouched, a place that hadn't been organized, fenced, or explained. The Amazon represented that idea perfectly. Not the version from postcards or nature books, but the vast interior, the part people talked about in lowered voices. I had read stories of men disappearing into it, of villages hidden from modern time, of rivers that rewrote the land each season. The jungle felt alive in a way cities never could. I didn't want comfort. I wanted immersion. Getting there took time. I worked whatever jobs I could, moving constantly, saving small amounts, imagining a future that felt more meaningful than the present. By the time I reached South America, I was already halfway gone, mentally detached from safety, from routine, from caution. I believed that determination alone could substitute for experience. In Bolivia, I met others who carried the same hunger. We were strangers, but ambition made us feel aligned. There was a man who spoke confidently about gold hidden deep in the rainforest, about routes that didn't exist on maps, about indigenous villages beyond contact. He spoke with certainty, and we listened. In hindsight, that was the moment where trust quietly replaced judgment. At first, everything felt right. The air was thick and green, the rivers wide and patient. Villages appeared and disappeared behind us as we moved farther away from anything familiar. Each step deeper felt like progress, not just geographically, but personally. I remember thinking that hardship was proof we were doing something worthwhile. What I didn't recognize then was how quickly optimism can disguise risk. The jungle does not announce danger, it absorbs it, it waits. Every decision we made felt small at the time, choosing a direction, trusting a plan, ignoring doubt. None of them felt fatal on their own. Standing at the edge of the forest, I believed the jungle would test me. I didn't yet understand that it would eventually strip everything away: plans, companions, certainty, and leave only one question behind: whether I could survive myself. The deeper we went, the quieter the world became. The jungle didn't roar like people imagine it, pressed in. Sound was absorbed by layers of leaves, damp earth, and endless green. Movement slowed, not because we wanted it to, but because the land demanded it. Every step had to be earned. At first, we treated the discomfort like a challenge. Wet clothes, insects, blisters, these were inconveniences, not warnings. We joked about them at night, laughing around small fires, convincing ourselves that suffering was temporary and progress was permanent. I told myself that this was what real exploration felt like: unpredictable, raw. But days passed, and the cracks began to show. Food became a constant calculation. We had brought supplies, but not enough for delays, and delays were everywhere. Rivers didn't flow the way maps suggested. Trails vanished without explanation. What looked close in the morning took all day to reach, if we reached it at all. Hunger crept in slowly, dulling thought and patience. I started noticing how quiet conversations became when meals were discussed. Fatigue changed us. One of us weakened faster than the rest, refusing food that others forced themselves to eat. Arguments didn't explode, they simmered. No one wanted to admit fear because admitting fear felt like admitting failure. We were too deep for doubt to feel useful. The man leading us continued to speak confidently, but his stories began to shift. Details changed, distances stretched. When questioned, he brushed it off, always promising that the hardest part was behind us. I wanted to believe him, we all did. Turning back felt worse than moving forward, even when forward no longer made sense. At night, lying on the ground, listening to the jungle breathe, I felt something new: unease without a clear source. Not panic, not fear, just a quiet awareness that control was slipping away. The jungle wasn't hostile, but it wasn't passive either. It was indifferent. And indifference, I would later learn, is far more dangerous. By the time we realized how low our supplies had become, pride had already taken over decision-making. We weren't navigating anymore. We were just reacting. Each day narrowed our options until retreat felt impossible and progress felt mandatory. Still, I told myself this was normal, that every expedition reached this point, that discomfort was temporary and clarity would return once we pushed through. I didn't know then that the jungle doesn't reward persistence the way humans expect. Sometimes it simply waits for you to make one more mistake. And we were getting very close to that mistake. When we finally turned back, it wasn't because we wanted to, it was because our bodies forced the decision. The jungle had stripped our supplies down to almost nothing, and the strain showed on all of us. Hunger sharpened tempers. Silence replaced optimism. Every step uphill felt like punishment for stubbornness. Reaching the village again felt like a reset, a thin second chance. We rested, ate, and tried to pretend the past days hadn't changed us. But something had shifted. Trust was no longer automatic. The man who had led us into the forest spoke again of another route, another opportunity, this time following the river. He described it as easier, faster, almost safe. The river, he said, would carry us out. Rivers have a way of sounding honest. With help from villagers, we built a raft. It was crude but solid enough to float, and in our weakened state, floating felt like mercy. The jungle receded slightly as the current took hold, and for the first time in days, movement didn't require effort. I remember thinking how quickly danger can feel like relief when you're exhausted. As we traveled downstream, the mood lifted. We laughed again. The river widened, the banks softened, and the sense of control returned briefly. Then, without warning, the story changed. He told us about a canyon ahead, rapids, waterfalls, sections that couldn't be navigated safely. And then he admitted something else. He couldn't swim. The confidence that had carried us this far collapsed in a single moment. It wasn't just fear I felt then. It was betrayal. Information withheld is a kind of lie, and now that lie was floating beneath us. The group fractured immediately. Voices rose. Accusations surfaced. The trust that once held us together dissolved under the pressure of consequence. There was no clean solution, only uncomfortable choices. Turning back against the current wasn't realistic. Continuing meant risk we couldn't fully measure. In the end, we split. Two of us stayed with the raft, choosing to face the river and whatever waited beyond. The others chose land, believing walking would be safer than surrendering to water. We promised to meet again. We believed it. Promises feel strongest just before they become impossible. As the raft drifted on, the jungle seemed to close ranks behind us. The river narrowed. The current strengthened. What had felt like escape began to feel like commitment to movement without certainty, to decisions that could no longer be undone. I remember looking at the water and realizing how thin the line was between progress and disaster. One mistake, one misjudgment. That's all it would take. At the time, I still thought the real danger lay ahead. I didn't yet understand that the most important moment had already passed, the moment we chose to keep going. The river changed its tone before it changed its shape. The current grew louder, more insistent, as if it were pulling us towards something it hadn't yet revealed. The banks tightened. Rocks appeared where open water had been moments before. We tried to steer, but steering was mostly an illusion. The raft moved where the river decided. Then we saw the mist. Water rising into the air meant only one thing. I remember shouting, though I don't remember the words. There was no time to think in full sentences anymore. We fought the current with poles, with hands, with panic. The raft twisted, slammed, spun sideways. The river didn't resist us. It ignored us completely. The edge came without drama. One moment, there was water beneath us. The next, there wasn't. I was thrown forward, pulled down, and swallowed by noise. The impact wasn't a single hit, it was many, layered together. Water, rock, air, water again. I lost all sense of direction. Up and down ceased to exist. I let go of the raft because my hands no longer knew what they were holding. When I surfaced, I gasped and spun, searching for anything familiar. The raft was gone. My friend was gone. The river carried me whether I wanted it to or not. I fought until exhaustion took over, then floated, half-conscious, until I was thrown against the shore. Silence followed. Not the peaceful, kind, the stunned kind. I called out. Once, twice, over and over. My voice sounded small, swallowed almost immediately by the jungle. No answer came back. I waited, listening for movement, for a shout, for anything that suggested I wasn't alone. Nothing. I told myself separation was temporary, that he had made it to shore somewhere else, that we would find each other upriver. I believed this because the alternative was too heavy to hold all at once. For days, I searched along the riverbanks. I moved against the current, slipping, falling, calling his name until my voice gave out. The jungle offered no feedback, no signs, no reassurance, just green, water, and distance. The moment I understood I was alone didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in. It arrived when my calls went unanswered one final time, when the jungle's indifference became undeniable. When I realized that if something happened to me now, no one would know where to look. I sat by the river and felt something hollow open inside me. Not fear, not yet. Something quieter, a realization that plans no longer existed, that rescue was no longer an assumption. From that point on, every decision would be mine alone. Every mistake would belong only to me. I stood up, wet, bruised, shaking, and looked into the forest. The jungle hadn't changed. I had. That was the moment everything broke. Not the fall, not the separation, but the understanding that survival was no longer shared. It was personal. Once I accepted that I was alone, the jungle felt closer. Not louder or more violent, closer. Every sound seemed to come from just beyond my shoulder. Every movement in the leaves felt deliberate, as if the forest had finally acknowledged me as something separate, something exposed. The first problem was food. Hunger had followed us for days before the separation, but now it sharpened into something constant and demanding. My thoughts circled it endlessly. I searched for anything familiar, fruit, roots, signs of safety, but the jungle offers abundance without instruction. Many things look edible. Many things are not. I ate what I could identify with confidence and avoided everything else. Even then, my stomach protested. Energy drained quickly. Walking became slower, more deliberate. Each step had to be weighed against how much strength it would cost me. Sleep was worse. At night, the jungle didn't rest. Insects crawled over my skin. Sounds layered over each other. Movement, calls, splashes from the river nearby. I slept in fragments, waking repeatedly, unsure of what had pulled me back into consciousness. The ground was never dry. My clothes never fully dried either. Everything stayed damp, including my skin. My feet began to soften, then blister. Small cuts refused to close. Infection crept in quietly, without pain at first. I noticed the smell before I noticed the damage. That frightened me more than the hunger. Pain I could endure. Decay felt different. It felt like time turning against me. I tried to stay near the river, believing it might eventually lead me to people. The current was my only guide. But the river flooded suddenly, rising without warning, swallowing ground I had stood on hours before. Twice I stepped into what looked like solid earth and sank. Thick mud pulled at my legs, holding me down while water climbed higher around me. Panic surged both times, sharp and immediate. I escaped by instinct more than skill, clawing my way out, heart racing long after I reached safety. After that, fear settled into my body like a second pulse. Days blurred together. Without markers, time lost meaning. I measured it by hunger, by exhaustion, by how much light remained in the sky. I talked to myself out loud, partly to stay focused, partly to remind myself that I still existed as a thinking person. Then the loneliness deepened. At some point, my mind began filling the silence on its own. I heard voices where none existed. I imagined conversations, faces, presence. One figure stayed with me, comforting, familiar. I knew on some level that she wasn't real. But acknowledging that didn't make her disappear. At night, when the fear grew strongest, I welcomed the illusion. It felt like companionship, and companionship felt like survival. Physically, I was weakening. My foot throbbed constantly now, swollen and discolored. Walking became an act of will rather than movement. Still, I forced myself forward. Stopping felt dangerous. Resting too long felt like surrender. There were moments when I considered letting go, not actively, not dramatically, just sitting down and allowing exhaustion to decide for me. Those moments scared me more than the river or the animals or the hunger. They felt calm, reasonable. Each time, something pulled me back, a memory, a sound, a stubborn refusal to disappear without being noticed. I didn't think about rescue anymore. Hope, in that form, required energy I no longer had. Instead, I focused on the next step, the next breath, the next patch of ground that wouldn't swallow me whole. The jungle hadn't killed me yet. That didn't mean it wouldn't. It only meant the struggle wasn't finished. By the second week, the battle was no longer physical. My body was failing, but slowly, predictably. My mind, on the other hand, had become unfamiliar territory. Thoughts no longer followed straight lines. They looped, fractured, vanished halfway through forming. I would stop walking because I'd forgotten why I started. The jungle amplified this. There was no silence, yet nothing responded to me. No confirmation that my actions mattered. In that absence, my mind began creating its own structure. Memories replayed themselves with unusual clarity. Faces from my past appeared uninvited. Conversations repeated, altered slightly each time, as if my mind were testing different outcomes. The woman returned often. She spoke to me without words, offering calm when panic rose. I understood she wasn't real, but understanding didn't make her less present. When you're alone long enough, the mind doesn't ask permission before inventing company. It simply does what it must to survive. At times I felt strangely normal, focused, even peaceful. Those moments were dangerous. They made me question whether I was actually in danger at all, whether I was overreacting, whether stopping would be acceptable. The jungle felt endless, but not hostile in those moments, just permanent. Then reality would crash back in. A sharp pain, a slip, a surge of hunger so intense it felt like nausea. My foot worsened, the skin breaking down further, infection creeping upward. I could feel heat radiating from it, could smell it even when I tried to ignore it. Each step sent a dull shock through my body. I argued with myself constantly. Out loud, I negotiated. I promised rest after certain distances, then broke those promises when stopping felt worse than continuing. Logic became flexible, reshaped by fatigue. What once would have seemed irrational began to feel reasonable. There were moments I laughed, short, startled sounds that surprised me as much as they did the jungle. Laughter without humor, without context. It wasn't joy, it was release. I began marking progress in meaningless ways, counting steps, touching certain trees, creating small rituals that made movement feel intentional. Without them, everything blurred into one long green corridor. The river flooded again. Water rose quickly, forcing me to higher ground. I spent hours perched in a tree, clutching branches, watching debris rush past below me. The water was loud, violent, unstoppable. I remember thinking how easy it would be to let go, how quickly the jungle could end the struggle if it chose to. Instead, it waited. When the water receded, it left behind mud, rot, and exhaustion. I climbed down and continued, weaker than before. My body shook more often now, especially at night. Cold settled into my bones, even in the humidity. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, filled with vivid dreams that followed me into waking. At some point, I accepted that survival no longer looked heroic. There was no strength left to draw from, no determination left to summon. What remained was momentum, forward movement driven by habit, not hope. I no longer imagined rescue clearly. I imagined being found after the fact. Imagined my story being told by someone else. That thought unsettled me enough to keep moving. The jungle had stripped me down to something basic: hunger, fear, motion. Thought itself felt like a luxury. And yet, somewhere beneath the confusion, a small, stubborn awareness remained. As long as I was moving, I was alive. And as long as I was alive, the story wasn't finished. The rain began without warning. Not a gradual shift, not a distant sound, just sudden weight falling from the sky. Within minutes, the ground changed. Paths disappeared. The river rose again, faster this time, darker and more aggressive. I had learned enough by then to respect how quickly water could turn against me. I tried to move uphill, but my body resisted. Every step sent pain through my leg. My infected foot barely responded the way I needed it to. When I slipped, I slid farther than expected, landing hard in thick mud that pulled at me immediately. The sensation was familiar and terrifying. The mud closed around my legs, tightening as I struggled. The harder I pulled, the deeper I sank. Panic surged, sharp and absolute. I forced myself to stop thrashing. Breathing came fast, shallow. I pressed my hands into the ground, spreading my weight, inching backward the way instinct suggested rather than logic. It worked, barely. I lay there for a long time afterward, rain soaking through me, heart pounding, unable to stand immediately. I knew then how close the jungle had come to ending everything without effort, without drama. No predators, no injuries, just gravity and patience. Later, trying to cross what looked like shallow water, I misjudged the depth and stepped into a flooded channel. The current grabbed me instantly. I went under, water filling my mouth, my nose, my ears. I kicked wildly, disoriented, convinced this was the moment that would decide everything. I surfaced coughing, scraping myself against rocks as I clawed toward the edge. When I reached land, I collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. My body felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been left behind in the water. After that, something shifted. Fear stopped escalating. It settled. Death no longer felt abstract. It felt nearby, familiar. That should have broken me. Instead, it simplified everything. I stopped imagining futures. I stopped asking questions. I focused on what needed to be done to remain conscious, to remain moving. Food was almost non-existent now. I ate less, not because I was careful, but because my body no longer demanded it loudly. Hunger became background noise, like pain. My weight dropped rapidly. My strength followed. I reached a point where standing up felt like a decision I might not be able to repeat. Each time I rested, I worried I wouldn't rise again. Still, something inside me resisted stopping. Not courage, not hope, just refusal. The hallucinations faded, replaced by clarity that felt sharp and cold. I knew exactly where I was lost, injured, alone, and exactly what that meant. There was no comfort in denial anymore, only honesty. I moved toward the river again, drawn by the possibility that it might still lead somewhere. My progress was slow, uneven, marked by frequent pauses. When I reached the water's edge, I sat and watched it move past me, indifferent and constant. I thought about letting it carry me, about surrendering to movement without resistance. The idea felt peaceful, final. Instead, I stayed. I don't know why. There was no reasoning behind it. No memory strong enough to explain the choice. I simply remained where I was, breathing, watching, existing. That decision to stay rather than drift became the quiet line between living and disappearing. Persistence, I learned then, doesn't always feel powerful. Sometimes it feels like nothing more than choosing not to let go. I didn't know a search had begun. From where I was, the jungle still felt absolute, unchallenged, uninterrupted. But subtle changes started to register, the kind you only notice when you've been alone too long. A broken branch that felt intentional, a faint disturbance along the riverbank that didn't match the water's rhythm. At first, I dismissed it. My mind had betrayed me before. I trusted nothing that hinted at hope. I stayed near the river, conserving what little strength I had left. Walking far no longer felt possible. I rested often, sitting or lying where I could watch the water pass. My body had learned its limits the hard way, and I stayed just inside them. Then I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was different. A distant call, human in shape if not in detail. I froze, afraid to move, afraid the sound would vanish if I acknowledged it. I listened again. Silence returned, heavy and complete. I waited. Time stretched. My breathing slowed. When the sound came again, closer this time. I forced myself to respond. My voice was weak, unfamiliar even to me, but it existed. I called out once, then again, each attempt draining more energy than I could spare. Movement followed. Figures emerged slowly from the jungle, not suddenly, not dramatically. They appeared as if they had always been there, part of the landscape itself. Indigenous men, calm and deliberate, scanning the ground with practiced awareness. They didn't rush when they saw me. They approached carefully, as if sudden movement might break something fragile. Relief didn't arrive immediately. My body didn't know how to process it. I felt detached, almost observational, as if I were watching someone else being found. They spoke to me, but the words blurred together. I understood tone before meaning. They supported me gently, methodically. Someone checked my foot, their expression tightening briefly before smoothing again. That small reaction told me how close I had come to not making it. As they helped me toward the river, I learned that my friend had survived, that people had gone looking, that I hadn't vanished unnoticed after all. The realization landed slowly, carefully, like something that could still break if handled too roughly. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I simply allowed myself to stop moving. For the first time in weeks, the jungle loosened its grip, not because it chose to, but because I was no longer alone within it. Being carried felt unfamiliar. My body had spent weeks negotiating every movement, calculating effort and consequence. Now, hands lifted me without asking, and I let them. The simple act of surrendering weight felt profound. As we moved, the jungle passed differently than before. It no longer felt like a maze or a threat. It became background again, dense, alive, indifferent. I watched it from a distance I hadn't had in weeks, aware that the separation mattered more than the scenery itself. Pain returned in waves. With safety came sensation. My foot burned sharply now, no longer dulled by exhaustion or necessity. My muscles cramped as if protesting this sudden end of constant motion. Each jolt reminded me how damaged my body really was. When we reached the river, I saw a familiar face. My friend stood there, thinner than I remembered, eyes wide with disbelief. The moment felt unreal, like one of the many images my mind had invented to survive the silence. I waited for it to dissolve. It didn't. We didn't speak much. There was nothing urgent to say. Survival had stripped language down to its basics, and what mattered most didn't need words. Being seen was enough. As we traveled toward help, my awareness narrowed. The edges of my vision softened. I drifted in and out, anchored by movement and voices that stayed steady and calm. Each time I slipped, I reminded myself that this was different from before. This time, letting go didn't mean disappearing. In the hospital, the jungle finally released me completely. Clean sheets, controlled light. The smell of disinfectant replacing rot and damp earth. Doctors spoke in measured tones, cataloging damage I had only felt in fragments. Infection, malnutrition, exhaustion. Nothing surprising, just confirmation. Recovery stretched ahead of me, long and uncertain. But for the first time since the river, uncertainty didn't feel threatening. It felt open. I had crossed a line I couldn't fully describe yet. I had been reduced, tested, stripped of everything unnecessary. What remained was fragile but intact. I was alive. And that, I understood now, was not a small thing. Recovery gave me time, too much of it at first. Time to replay moments I couldn't escape. Time to feel sensations return where numbness had once protected me. My body healed in stages. My mind followed a different schedule. What stayed with me wasn't the hunger or the pain. It was the clarity. The way the jungle removed everything I thought defined me and left only what was essential. Fear, yes, but also awareness. Fragility. Presence. I had gone into the jungle believing survival was about strength and endurance. I left understanding that survival is often quieter than that. It's attention, restraint, knowing when to push forward and when not to disappear. The jungle didn't reward bravery or punish mistakes. It simply responded to reality. For a long time afterward, crowds felt strange. Noise felt unnecessary. I lived in a world where every sound mattered, where every decision had weight. Returning to normal life felt less like a victory and more like an adjustment. The jungle took certainty from me. It took arrogance. It took the illusion that preparation guarantees safety. But it gave something back, in return perspective, that never faded. I learned that being alone doesn't always mean being lost. That fear doesn't always mean weakness. That persistence can exist without hope, and that sometimes survival is nothing more than staying present when everything else falls away. I didn't conquer the jungle. I didn't escape it through strength. I passed through it by refusing, quietly and repeatedly, to stop. And that lesson stayed with me long after the forest released its hold.